Real life parenting from the heart. Real life parenting from the heart.
Hey friends, on behalf of the Family Wellness team, we are excited to be with you again to continue our parenting series, Real Life Parenting, Parenting from the Heart. And this segment is called How Kids Are Wired, Parenting Principles that Cultivate. Here's a couple things we're going to pay attention to. Cultivate empathy and boundary setting. So right there, we want to almost pause in a sense to absorb, to get a sense of where we're headed and what makes a not only a Christ-centered home, but an emotionally healthy home. And foundationally, and we're going to take the time to unpack this a bit, foundationally, what would be true is it would be a home that knows how to show up with empathy and a home that knows how to show up with healthy boundaries. So let's unpack it. Let's take a look.
As we begin, let's pause to journal. In your own words, describe the importance of cultivating empathy and boundary setting in your parenting life.
As we kind of prepare for our little journey together, we do encourage that not only will we have opportunity during our class to interact with one another, because I think some of the greatest learning happens when we hear and listen and share with other parents, but also we'll have opportunity to do some journaling, some reflecting, some writing, not only during the class, but between classes. So we really look forward to that, because application, really the sense of like, what about all this that we're going to talk about applies to me, and what we hear and what my spouse hears, in what way do we need to make adjustments that are appropriate. So our emphasis is how kids are wired, which appropriately guides us toward just the idea that we want to understand them. That if we're going to have anything that is effective, anyone we work with, we'd understand who it is we're working with. And in the task of parenting, we would appreciate the idea that we have a deep understanding of our children so that we know how they're wired, we know foundationally what they need. Keep in mind all your children and all the variations in which they show up. And we really do look to the Lord to give us that discernment of really understanding what's presenting itself in the life of my child, in the life of their emotions, in the life of their behavior. So we're going to take a look at how kids are wired and a couple of super important kind of non-negotiable needs that kids have. Alrighty, come with me on this. We've got a couple of fundamental needs I want us to cover. And the research on this is remarkable. I'm going to try to summarize it the best I can. When we think about these two fundamental needs of every child, the first one, and we might even think of this on our own in that it's so sensible and so foundational, it's the primary need for attachment. That beyond our physical needs, which is super important for any child to thrive, that kind of the emotional version of that would be that a child would experience a kind of emotional connection, being nurtured, feeling connected to a source of love, of nurture, of life, safety, emotionally being tuned into. Now, the brain science around that is that as a child is nurtured emotionally and physically and just as a person, and that's consistent, that the brain development is such that it starts producing endorphins, a kind of natural opiate that gives a child a sense of a good feeling, a safe feeling, a feeling of feeling alive, a kind of thriving is developing in the life of the child as they receive this kind of nurture. This attachment to love, an attachment to mom and dad, to the family, this attachment of I belong somewhere, I'm not isolated, I don't have to go into survival mode, I can actually get a sense of what living feels like. This meets the primary needs of every child. From that, they get a sense that, and not that they would even put it this way, but their lived experiences that they're created for connection. This idea that when I'm connected to this love, love makes sense, I thrive, I feel more human. And so then that informs what their adult relationships are going to be like later in life. So they have this kind of compass inside, a kind of true north that says, I feel fully alive when I love others and I allow others to love me. It informs how they do their relationships based on secure attachment. These needs are so fundamental. It's true in the animal world, bird world, human species. The only thing distinctive about us humans is that we need that attachment for more years than anything else and anyone else on the planet. And so fundamental need number one is attachment. Now, let's take a look at fundamental need number two, is described as authenticity. Now, authenticity is the child's ability to be connected to themselves. But how does this formulate? Well, when we nurture our children in such a way and we're tuning in to understand them, they get a sense that who they are is who they're supposed to be. And certainly we guide it. We're going to be talking about boundary setting in a few minutes. But this idea that we see who they are, we tune into that person, and they could be their authentic selves. That their childhood isn't kind of a drill of just falling in line. I'm supposed to be like that one, or like that sibling, or like that parent, and I'm accepted when I'm like them. That does not give them the ability to connect with who they are and their connection with themselves. Very often in parenting, total obedience at any cost would be at the cost of the child's authenticity, their sense of they get to be who they are in a safe environment around people who know who they are, and that the uniqueness and even differences among each other can still give an environment of connection and appreciation. And we think about that. I'll give just a little scenario where, let's say a little child, little girl, is upset that she couldn't have a cookie. And because the child's young, they don't know how to manage their emotions, they get angry. Now imagine that, let's say that mom doesn't like anger, maybe came from a childhood where anger was volatile and the emotion of anger felt unsafe. And so automatically the mother shuts down that interaction as if anger is a bad thing. And the mother says to the little child, "Good girls don't get angry." And yet the message that the little girl hears is, angry girls don't get loved. So this is a common scenario where a child in their attempt to be themselves in some kind of wobbly ways at times, in their attempt to be their authentic selves, when that gets shut down, what happens is between attachment and authenticity, they'll trade away authenticity every time, conform, sort of suck it up, shut it down in order to stay attached, because attachment need is so primary. And they go on in life not knowing how to connect with themselves. From that connection with self is where a child gets confidence, where a child even gets a gut feeling, a sense of who they are, knowing how to listen to what's going on inside. And so we'd see in these two primary needs, attachment informs a child on how to be connected in their relationships, and authenticity gives a child a sense of how to connect with themselves so that their true self, their authentic self, knows how to show up in life. So let's think about that.
Attachment and authenticity. Many of us recognize the importance of a child feeling attached to their parents. Now reflect and share your thoughts on the importance of the need to cultivate authenticity. What can occur in the emotional development of a child when a child is not allowed to show up with authenticity in family life?
Now, our families go back a few generations. And if we even think about the first family with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, we see the big fall, the big fracture that happened when the serpent tempted Adam and Eve, is it really compromised their attachment to God, and it really gave them confusion around who they were to be truly human. Confusion around their authentic selves, and that authenticity is found within our deep heart, and within our deep heart is where God dwells. That got compromised many generations ago, as described in the scriptures. So our family tree, if you will, goes back to that tree a long time ago. And maybe we've even noticed family patterns that have not served our families well, that have caught up to us. And so we want to think about where we are today and the opportunity we have to make some adjustments, kind of a little guideline with this idea of attachment and authenticity. Now, as we unpack that, then we just want to sensibly say, hey, sign me up. I want to understand how my kids are wired. How are they wired? Let's take a look. Some of you who know me know that I try to get these concepts in really simple ways so I can understand it. When I think about how kids are wired, I summarize it this way. Now, thankfully, I believe they only have two wires. So do you want to understand how kids are wired? Okay, let's take a look at these two. I believe they have two wires. One of them's red and one of them's blue. As we take a look at that, how do we understand red and blue? Well, if we understand basically developmental psychology and the emotional life and emotional development of children, we would know that the red wire is their emotions, is their emotional life, is what's going on inside. What's going on in their life emotionally, that's red wire. Blue wire is their behavior. Now, you've heard the term acting out, like, oh, that kid's acting out in the produce section over at the grocery store. Well, yeah, we often use the term acting out kind of as a figure of speech. However, acting out is a clinical term, and that is the younger the child, the more they act out their emotions through their behavior, because cognitively they can't communicate all of what's going on inside, and it comes out through their behavior, through their volatility, through their reaction. And very often what we find is that if we don't understand how they're wired, we might see the behavior as only something to be corrected, not knowing what's presenting itself is the expression of something, very often, quite importantly, what's going on inside of them emotionally. If we only target the behavior, we miss the emotion. And if we only target the emotion, we may not take a look at how to guide the behavior. So we want to understand that how our kids are wired is with two wires, red wire, blue wire. Now we're going to take a little pause here for a little brainstorm moment. Okay, let's take a look.
Red wire, blue wire. What is your impression of the relationship between the wires? How emotions, red wire, come out in the behavior, blue wire, of the child? In what ways is it important for you to understand the relationship between emotions, red wire, and behavior, blue wire?
Okay, as we've been reflecting on our kids' wiring, and we do pause and we think about their red wire, their emotions, their blue wire, their behavior, that's kind of foundational, kind of basic, super important though. But let's pause just to say, in what way do I understand the red wire of my kids and the blue wire of my kids? And it varies from child to child. And so as we reflect on that, then we'd also do something super orthodox, and that is we'd self-reflect. And luckily we only have two wires, and they're kind of color coordinated, red wire, blue wire. What's our red wire? This kind of summarizes the two tasks of parenting. The red wire is empathy, our ability to tune into the red wire, the emotional life, the emotional experience of our child. That's empathy. It's emotional attending, showing up to it, attending that event when they have emotions going on. We like to say empathetic curiosity, that there'd be a curiosity, not so quick to correct, but quick to be curious. What is going on, rather than just correcting it and get it out of the way. It's complicating our day when you have that feeling. No, we want the curiosity to be like, let me tune in. Now, keep in mind, this curiosity actually ups our emotional intelligence. People who are emotionally curious are the ones who get emotionally intelligent. Next segment, next month, will be all around the emotionally intelligent parent. And so as we think about that, the parent that is emotionally curious listens for not just right answers and right behavior from our kid. We go beyond that to listens for emotional content, so that the child's feelings and emotions, experiences can be validated. Not that all their feelings are meant to be evaluated as right or wrong, but that their emotions and their experience is validated as what they're having so that it reinforces attachment. There's not a feeling that's going to detach us, and authenticity, so that's their feeling. They get a sense of we tuned in to them and what's going on for them, and it allows them to, again, feel more connected to themselves. We're going to run a little video on empathy, and maybe you've seen this before. We like to show this as often as we can. We show it in marriage workshops too. Check it out. Kind of take notes if you can. There's some good, very important components of what it means to have empathy and how it shows up in our relationships. Let's do it.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, and climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, on to the blue wire. And that would be boundary setting. This idea that we have boundaries in our home, kind of where we draw the lines. It's not meant to be rigid where once it's drawn, it never moves. It's meant to make sense for the stage our child is in, make sense of where our values are. But this idea of boundary setting is kind of like a stability in the family where it's not a guessing game on why that reaction came out of that parent, but the lines are clarified. Kind of like a good sports game where if we tried to play basketball without any kind of out of bounds, it'd be a chaotic game. And so as it is with family life, families that don't have clear boundaries leads to a lot of chaos and unpredictability, which then can often compromise a sense of attachment and authenticity. So boundary setting really does line up words and actions. If it were a no trespassing sign, our boundary words would be the no trespassing, where we're communicating that's not okay, or let's not do that, let's change that kind of behavior, let's work on this. That's the no trespassing in big letters is our words. And then in the small print on that sign, it often says violators will be prosecuted. This idea that my actions will follow up my words. That's going to be a real trick and a really skillful part of boundary setting is that we match up our words and actions. Notice that boundary setting isn't punishment. Boundary setting doesn't have to be angry. Boundary setting isn't about that's wrong, you're bad, and then of course that leads to all kind of detachment and internal messaging that ends up being negative in the life of the child. No, boundary setting is sanity. It's clarification where the lines are, and we reinforce it with natural consequences. Consequences is not a punishing behavior. It's a natural consequence to what went on, and we try to give a clue to our kids what kinds of consequences usually match up with certain kinds of boundaries that get crossed. So this idea of blue wire brings a sense of clarity. Okay, what happens when wires get crossed, and what do I mean by that? Very often, the person you married, don't you just love them? Sometimes they have a kind of wiring when it comes to parenting that's different than yours. So it's not uncommon that we as individuals tend to gravitate a little more toward, oh, I'm a red wire parent. I want to hear their feelings. Yep, I'm all red wire. Then other parents are like, yeah, whatever. I'm blue wire. Let's get some order. No means no. This is not complicated. Let's get the show on the road. And the blue wire parent is going to be more about boundary setting, more about consistency. The red wire parent tends to be more around the heartbeat of the child and emotions going on. And very often, we can find that we married the other wire. And this is where our wires can get crossed. I don't mind us taking a moment to even take a look at who among us are red wire parents, who among us are blue wire parents. Let's take a moment for that.
When wires get crossed. For parents, our red wire includes responding with empathy, tuning into emotions, and awareness of what is going on in the inner emotional life of our child. Blue wire includes boundary setting, clarifying limits, actions and follow-through congruent with our words. Most parents have a primary or dominant wire. If you had to pick your dominant wire, are you more a red wire or a blue wire? Have parenting differences created conflict in your marriage?
All right, we did a little sample size there on who among us are red wire and blue wire. And of course, we could be a little bit of both, but very often we have a little bit of a dominant color among us here, red or blue. However, what we want to keep in mind is very often it's the source of a lot of marital discord. Divorce rates go up when children are toddlers and teenagers, because that is when a lot of testing of limits happens with our children, and a lot of this happens among us. And so this idea of what kind of dynamics happen in our marriages as co-parents. And so sometimes if we sense that we don't relate to the wire of our co-parent, we may overdo. If we feel like, oh, the co-parent is too harsh with those boundaries, we may go even softer with staying in the emotions. If the blue wire parent is saying like, oh my gosh, they're going to talk forever about it, I just got to lay down the law, then they may go too far to feel like they're compensating for the other. Very often then the child is left to not appreciate the blend of red wire, blue wire, but to then base it on personality, and then they learn to sort of manipulate what parent they go to based on their needs. So this idea, and this is our call here, people, and I do believe this is where we're going to qualify as Christ-centered parents. What's going to qualify us is an open heart to say, Lord, teach me the part I don't get. Develop the part that's not developed. So the challenge would be, I think a healthy challenge is that for us red wire parents, we'd learn, how do I develop more of my blue wire? And for us blue wire parents, how do I develop more of my red wire? Because our children need both parents having both wires. It doesn't work in our kids' lives if I get my red wire needs from this parent, I get my blue wire needs from that parent. That only splits the child and doesn't develop both wires within the child. So let's respond to that challenge of our own development humbly as we consider that the calling, I believe the will of God is in our parenting life, that we're willing to develop whatever it takes, develop both that red wire being more empathetic, and more that blue wire of being more skillful in our boundary setting. We love to integrate our teaching in family wellness with the scriptures and, of course, with good, solid behavioral science. And one of our favorite scriptures as a team is the gospel reading from the parable of the Good Samaritan. And St. John Chrysostom reminds us that that Samaritan represents Christ, the one who didn't go away from the brokenness of the person, but leaned in and moved toward that person. Of course, it concludes the parable and says, go and do likewise. So not only does Christ do it that way, but we're instructed on how to show up in our relationships. And some of our most primary, most important relationships are the ones we're cultivating with our children. And so we see in the parable that there is this idea is when they're acting out the most, when they're most broken, when they're stuck in the ditch, like in that parable, is when we go where they are. We're not waiting, tapping our toe for them to figure it out and come to us. We go where they are. That's the principle of the incarnation. Distinct in our faith as Christians is that we don't have a religion that where God says, I'm way up here, now figure out how to get here. It's a faith that says, I love you so much, I'll find you where you are. And that's our call as parents with our red wire and blue wire, with our sense of attachment and authenticity. We come alongside where they are. This idea that we see them as people. Our child knows when we appreciate who they are as a person. We see them pupil to pupil. And that when we get there, even in the midst of their struggle at times, that they have a sense that we are extending compassion. And we know already in our parenting world that our calling is to suffer with them as they struggle. But when we're with them, then they have a sense of that security. It releases some good, right chemicals in their brain such that they want to be connected to us in their time of need. So we hope that this helps. We're going to reflect a little bit more and discuss a little bit more. I'm glad we could do this together.
Real life parenting from the heart. Real life parenting from the heart.